He walked into the lobby of a building where his name was on the calendar, his company's future on the line. But to the receptionist behind the desk, he wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a man about to close a multi-million-dollar deal. To her, he was nobody. Just another face she could wave away with a smirk. She told him to leave. Without knowing, she had just turned away the very man who could decide her company's fate. What happened next wasn't loud, but it was devastating. Because sometimes the quietest moves leave the deepest scars. But this was only the beginning, and the real story hadn't even started yet. Terrence Dupree wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He grew up in a small Alabama home that leaned after every storm, raised by parents who worked long hours just to keep the lights on. From a young age, he learned to fix what was broken: old computers, worn-out bikes, even his own future. By the time he was 16, he had built his first computer from discarded parts, not to play games, but to teach himself the language of code. That persistence carried him through college, through failures, and finally into building D-Tech Solutions, a company he grew from nothing into a powerhouse worth millions. To most, he was a success story. But on that rainy morning in Minneapolis, when he walked into the marble lobby of Holston and Royce, none of that mattered. Not to the woman at the front desk, because sometimes, no matter how far you climb, prejudice waits at the door. And Terrence was about to learn just how costly one's smirk could become. The rain tapped gently against the glass doors as Terrence stepped into the polished lobby of Holston and Royce. The marble floors gleamed, the fluorescent lights buzzed, and the scent of espresso lingered in the air. He carried no entourage, no flashy watch, no badge swinging from his neck, just a worn leather briefcase and the calm presence of a man who had earned every step of his journey. He approached the desk with quiet confidence, ready to finalize a partnership worth over $40 million. But Megan, the receptionist, barely looked up. Her AirPods still in, her fingers tapping at her phone, she sized him up with a glance that lasted only seconds, but carried a lifetime of assumptions. To her, he wasn't the CEO of a thriving tech firm. He wasn't the man they had flown across the country to meet. He was just another outsider who didn't belong in her pristine lobby. Vendors need to use the back entrance. That was all she said before rolling her eyes and dismissing him. Terrence paused, not because he doubted himself, but because he had seen this scene play out too many times before, in hotels, at conferences, even in boardrooms where people mistook him for staff. His name was on the calendar, his company was on the line. Yet in that moment, all she saw was someone who didn't look like he deserved a seat at their table. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded and turned to leave. To Megan, it looked like a small victory. An inconvenience waved away. But she had just shut the door on the deal that was supposed to save her company's future. As Terrence reached the exit, the elevator doors slid open. A young associate stepped out, freezing in shock when he saw him. His eyes widened. "Mr. Dupree?" But Terrence only lifted a hand gently, cutting him off. "Tell them thank you for the opportunity," he said calmly, stepping back into the rain. The elevator doors closed behind the stunned associate, sealing Megan's mistake like a trap about to spring. What Megan didn't know, what none of them knew, was who they had just dismissed. Terrence Dupree wasn't a man easily replaced. He had spent years building his reputation, carefully cultivating partnerships, and designing systems that entire industries relied on. Losing him wasn't just losing a deal. It was pulling the thread that could unravel everything. Outside, Terrence walked slowly down the street, the drizzle soaking his coat. His phone buzzed. A message from his vice president confirmed everything was ready for the contract's final signing. All it needed was his approval. He stopped under an awning, looked back at the tower of glass and steel behind him, and made a decision. With a single call, he redirected the entire deal to Holston and Royce's biggest competitor. He didn't need to shout or threaten. He didn't need revenge. All he had to do was move his value elsewhere. And in that quiet act, he signed the company's death sentence. Back inside, the board of directors gathered in a sleek conference room. 9 chairs filled, glasses of cucumber water untouched. The negotiator checked his watch again. No call, no email, nothing. An intern finally rushed in, out of breath. He stammered as he explained. Reception had turned Terrence away, mistaking him for a contractor. The silence that followed was suffocating. One by one, faces turned pale as the weight of the mistake sank in. Still, they didn't fully understand what they had lost. Not yet. Because in boardrooms like theirs, arrogance is slow to admit fault. They thought they could fix it. They thought a call, an apology, maybe even a better offer would bring him back. But Terrence wasn't coming back. He had already moved on. And within days, the fallout would begin. But what happened next didn't just ruin a deal. It shook the very foundation of the company. He thought walking away would be enough. But the storm his silence unleashed was only just beginning. The security guard's voice rose to a near shout, echoing through the marble lobby. "I told you! You don't belong here!" Everyone in the room froze. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. And there he was, our main character, standing in front of the desk with nothing but his briefcase, his ID badge in hand, and humiliation burning through his chest. He tried again, his voice steady but shaking inside. "I work here. My name is right there, on your list. Check again." But the guard didn't budge. Instead, he stepped closer, hand brushing the radio at his hip, the threat hanging heavy in the air. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were judging, whispering, assuming, and every whispered word felt like a blade. In that moment, it wasn't just about being denied entry. It was about being denied dignity, humanity, existence. His pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to disappear, but he knew. If he walked out now, he wasn't just leaving the building. He'd be leaving behind the fight to be seen. The guard smirked, louder this time. "I'm calling the police." That sentence cut through the silence like a gunshot. He could feel the weight of it, the danger of how quickly things could spiral. His mind flashed with headlines, names, stories of men who never made it home. Was this how it would end for him? Over nothing. The lobby lights seemed brighter, harsher, exposing him while everyone else stood safe in their comfort. He swallowed hard, his pride colliding with his fear. And then, with a trembling hand, he pulled out the badge. Not the work ID, but the federal badge. The one that told the world who he really was. The one that stripped every lie the guard had built in seconds. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The guard's smirk vanished, replaced by panic. Silence stretched long and heavy, broken only by the sharp crack of his own voice. "Now, do I belong here?" This was the breaking point. A moment so raw, so undeniable, that no one could look away. Because in that instant, the truth was exposed, and no excuse could cover it. But this wasn't the end. Because what happened after would reveal even more than anyone expected. The room eventually moved on, conversations resuming as if nothing had happened. But for him, nothing would ever be the same. He walked into that meeting, yes, badge in hand, head high, but the taste of humiliation lingered, bitter and sharp. The deal went through, the signatures were made, but none of it erased the way he had been stripped of dignity before his colleagues, before strangers, before the world. He carried that moment home like a shadow. Every time he replayed it, the anger returned, not just at the guard, but at the system that allowed it. Because the truth was clear, if he hadn't had that badge, if he hadn't had proof of his status, the story could have ended very differently. And that thought haunted him more than anything. It wasn't just a personal insult. It was a reminder of how quickly skin could erase a resume, how prejudice could erase years of hard work, how one assumption could erase a man's humanity. He realized this wasn't just his story. It was the story of countless others who never got the chance to pull out a badge, who were silenced before they could even speak. And that's the impact that lasts. Because racism doesn't just wound the individual. It poisons the air we all breathe. It divides, it humiliates, it destroys trust in the very places where safety and fairness should exist. So he asked himself, what now? Stay silent, keep the badge as his shield, and hope the next encounter wouldn't escalate? Or speak up, risk the backlash, and make sure no one else had to endure what he did? This is where his story becomes our story. Because whether or not we've stood in his shoes, we all live in a world shaped by moments like these. And the question that lingers, the one none of us can escape, is this: how many more times must a person prove they belong before we finally believe them? The answer depends on what we choose to do next: to listen, to see, to refuse to look away. Because silence doesn't protect anyone, but action, your voice, your choice, your courage, just might.